Stepping on the Cracks by Mary Downing Hahn. Chapter 3. A couple of days later, Elizabeth and I were sitting on a platform we'd built in the oak tree at the end of my yard, as far from the house as we could get. Out of our mother's sight, we were less likely to be called inside to help with boring chores. According to Elizabeth, it was a known fact that people didn't think to look up when they were searching for someone. From where we sat, we could see Mother picking tomatoes in our victory garden. She was proud of all the vegetables we'd grown. It was one of our contributions to the war effort, she told me, like saving scrap and buying bonds. Anything we could do to help our country helped Jimmy, so she worked in the garden every day, weeding and watering, keeping the rows as neat and straight as a picture. The back of Mother's flowered house dress was dark with sweat, and she paused every now and then to swat at the mosquitoes circling her head. I knew I should go down and help her, but the heat drained my energy. Wisps of hair escaped from my braids and stuck to my neck, and my jersey felt like it was wallpapered to my skin. "What do you want to do?" I asked Elizabeth. "I don't know." Elizabeth caught a ladybug and watched it crawl up her arm. That was how bored she was. "We could play paper dolls," I suggested, "or Monopoly." "Not me." Elizabeth blew on the ladybug, and it flew away. "Hurry up," she said. "Your house is on fire and your children will burn." Yawning, she picked up a Captain Marvel comic book and turned the pages idly, barely looking at the pictures. She was wearing a ruffled top and a pair of white shorts with red bands on the side seams. In an outfit like hers, I would have looked like a walking skeleton. Even with the jersey on, each bone in my spine stuck out like a knob. Suddenly, Elizabeth pressed a finger against her lips. "Shh," she whispered, and pointed behind me. Peering through the leaves, I saw Gordy, Doug, and Toad coming down the alley. Gordy had gotten a real army helmet from somewhere, and he and Doug were carrying Daisy air rifles, the kind I'd seen advertised in comic books. Toad was wearing Gordy's old civil defense helmet, but his only weapon was a Roy Rogers cap pistol. They were pretending to be commandos, I think, running from garage to garage, signaling each other, crouching behind garbage cans. Every now and then, one of them would lob a rock at something and make an exploding grenade sound. "What dumbos," Elizabeth hissed in my ear. I nodded, too scared to say anything. The boys had come to a halt right under us. I could see the dented top of Gordy's army helmet and the crooked part in Doug's hair. Holding my breath, I clung to a limb, waiting for them to move on. But they knelt in the alley and pointed their guns at a thicket in the corner of our yard. "Come out of there, you dirty Nazi!" Gordy shouted at an imaginary enemy. Then Elizabeth did a really stupid thing. Grabbing an acorn, she aimed carefully and dropped it on Gordy's helmet. "Bombs away!" she yelled. "The sky is falling! The sky is falling!" Startled, Gordy looked up and spotted us in the tree. Vaulting the sagging fence, he grabbed one of the boards we'd nailed to the trunk and started climbing toward us. Like monkeys, Elizabeth and I scrambled higher into the branches, but Gordy caught Elizabeth's foot and yanked so hard she almost lost her grip and fell. "Let go!" She kicked at him with her other foot, landing a bare foot on his helmet with a satisfying thud. While I watched from above, Toad and Doug joined Gordy on the platform. I heard it creak under their weight. "Look, comics," Doug said. "The spoils of war." He picked them up and started sorting through them. The ones he didn't like he tore apart page by page and tossed off the platform. Angrily, I watched Porky Pig, Archie, Little Lulu, and Bugs Bunny drift down like leaves and land on the tangle of honeysuckle and poison ivy covering the fence. "Bombs away, lizard," Gordy said as another handful of colored pages rustled toward the ground. "Mother!" I screamed from high in the tree. "Mother, help!" But Mother didn't answer. Except for a lone black crow stalking up and down the rows of vegetables, the victory garden was deserted. From inside the house, she would never hear me yelling. "Hey, magpie, shut up," Gordy said, "or I'll shoot you full of BBs." I looked down at him, and, sure enough, he was aiming his air rifle at my rear end. If any boy would do something like that, Gordy would. "We can use these boards," Gordy said to Doug and Toad. While we watched, too scared of the air rifles to protest, The boys began tearing our platform apart. The nails screamed as they came loose, and the boards clattered down to the alley. "Girls can't build anything right," Gordy said as he yanked the last board free and tossed it on the pile. It took him less than 5 minutes to destroy what Elizabeth and I had spent hours constructing. "I bet they didn't even know which end of a hammer to hit the nail with." "I'm telling Joe when he gets home," Elizabeth said. "He'll come over to your house and beat you up." "Oh, Lizard, I am so scared," Gordy said, pitching his voice into a high falsetto. "I hate you," she yelled. "You're worse than a Nazi." "Geronimo!" Gordy shouted, and jumped out of the tree like a parachuter. On the ground, he helped Doug and Toad collect the scattered boards and comics. "We were spotting enemy planes from up here," Elizabeth screamed at them, "and you sabotaged us. That makes you a dirty, rotten traitor." "Shut up, Lizard, or I'll climb up there and—" Watching Elizabeth all the time, Gordy whispered the rest of his threat to Doug and Toad. They all laughed and whooped. "Only a tree trunk between you and me, Lizard," Gordy shouted. Then he and his two friends leapt down the bank and ran across the train tracks, carrying our boards and comics with them. Shaking with rage, I watched them disappear into the woods on the other side. If only a train would come along and smash them to smithereens. "Especially Gordy," Elizabeth muttered. "Just little parts of him would be left. A finger, a toe, a tooth. They would bury him in a teacup." She dropped down from the tree, and I scrambled after her. "Just wait," Elizabeth said as we began picking up the remains of our comics. "We'll get even with Gordy for this." While her back was turned, I shook my head. I didn't have any idea what sort of revenge she was planning, but I wasn't going to have any part of it. In my opinion, the farther we stayed away from Gordy, the safer we'd be. But I knew better than to argue with Elizabeth. The best thing to do was to keep quiet and hope she'd forget about Gordy. I should have known better. For days after Gordy wrecked our treehouse, Elizabeth talked of nothing but getting even with him. Luckily, she couldn't come up with a plan, which was fine with me. I sure didn't want to make Gordy hate us more than he already did. About a week later, Elizabeth and I were sitting in our tree. We'd tried to rebuild our platform twice, but every time we nailed it together, the boards disappeared. We were sure Gordy was taking them, but we never caught him in the act. At least he couldn't tear down the tree. We still had a private place to sit and talk. While Elizabeth was telling me every detail of a scary inner sanctum show she'd heard, a troop train roared past, drowning out her voice. There were lots of cars, and Elizabeth and I leaned out of the tree to wave to the soldiers. "Just think," Elizabeth said. "They might remember us when they're in their tanks or hiding in their foxholes. Those girls who waved, they'll say, we're making the world safe for them." I nodded, but I was thinking about Jimmy. Every soldier I saw reminded me of him. We'd finally gotten 3 letters all on the same day, just as I thought we might. Although Jimmy said he was fine, he hadn't put in any jokes. In my letter, he told me he missed me and drew a picture of himself carrying me piggyback. Under it, he'd written, "I hope you won't be too big for this when I come home." I noticed I looked smaller in the picture than I really am, and I realized I'd gotten taller since Jimmy left. "I hope they all come home safe," Elizabeth said, as the last car rumbled past. Silently, we watched the train shrink to a speck and vanish down the tracks. It was going north toward Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, carrying the soldiers to ships that would take them across the ocean to England and France, to Italy and Belgium, and someday maybe to Germany itself. "If you were a boy," Elizabeth said to me, "would you want to go to war?" "Would you?" "Of course." Elizabeth gave me a fierce look. "I wouldn't be scared. I'd be a hero." I bent my head to scratch a mosquito bite on my leg. If I had to go to war, I'd probably fall down on the battlefield and pretend to be dead till they stopped shooting. Unlike Elizabeth, I was a chicken through and through, and everybody, including her, knew it. Suddenly, Elizabeth poked me hard in the ribs. "Look who I see." Too far away to notice us in the tree, Gordy, Doug, and Toad were running across the tracks dressed as soldiers, as usual. Silently, we watched them scramble up the opposite bank and disappear into the woods. They must be going to that hut of theirs, Elizabeth muttered. For a moment she sat still, one hand curled around a limb, staring at the trees. Then she turned to me. Let's follow them and find out where it is. Maybe we could get our boards back. Wouldn't that be a great revenge? I stared at her, scared speechless. For one thing, my parents didn't allow me to cross the train tracks. But more than that, I was terrified of Gordy. What if he caught us down there in the woods? Who would hear or see? Who would rescue us? Unfortunately, Elizabeth didn't wait for me to agree or disagree. Assuming I'd follow her, she swung down from the tree and ran to the top of the railroad bank. When Elizabeth looked back to see where I was, she frowned. I was still sitting in the tree, clinging to a limb and wishing I had her nerve. Elizabeth was our favorite comic strip heroines: Wonder Woman, Mary Marvel, and Catwoman, all rolled up into one. Nothing scared her. Not leaping from trees, not crossing the train tracks, not even going into lonely, forbidden places where tramps lurked and boys like Gordy crept from tree to tree, armed with air rifles, just looking for girls like us. Come on, sissy baby, Elizabeth yelled. Reluctantly, I backed down the tree trunk, my legs and arms rubbery with fear. If Elizabeth was brave enough to go into the woods, I would go with her. Chapter 4. By the time I got to the top of the bank, Elizabeth was waving at me from the tracks. The steel rails stretched out of sight in both directions, northbound to Baltimore and southbound to Washington, wavering in the heat. 2 blocks away was the little yellow train station, and just beyond it was Calvert Road, the only crossing in College Hill. While I hesitated, an old black car rattled across the tracks and disappeared behind a line of trees, leaving a dust cloud behind. Nothing else stirred. College Hill slept in the afternoon heat. Not even Mr. Zimmerman and Major were in sight. Come on, Chicken Little, Elizabeth called up to me. She was balanced on a rail, tense with impatience. Cautiously, I slid down the bank, feeling the cinders roll out from under my feet. You know, we're not allowed to cross the train tracks, I told her. Shading her eyes with one hand, Elizabeth peered this way and that. Is there a mother in the house? She called. Scrambling up the other bank, she grinned at me from the top. No mothers anywhere in sight. Smarting under Elizabeth's scorn, I scampered across the shining tracks and blundered up the grassy bank. Elizabeth was ahead of me, running across the field toward the woods, and I dashed after her, anxious to catch up. A barbed wire fence stopped us for a moment. Old and rusty, it sagged to the ground. Elizabeth hopped over it, but I hesitated. On one strand of wire was a sign. Private property, no trespassing, I read. It was shot full of holes. What about this sign? I asked Elizabeth. Don't worry about it, she said. Nobody owns these woods. At least, nobody we know. Cautiously, I stepped over the sagging wire, afraid of scratching my legs. The rest gave you blood poisoning if you cut yourself. You got lockjaw and died a horrible death. Safely over the fence, I peered into the woods ahead. Everything was still and green and damp. A buzzing cloud of gnats circled my head. A woodpecker knocked away at a tree. A crow cawed. I was sure Gordy, Doug, and Toad were hiding in the bushes, watching us right now, aiming their air rifles at our hearts. Follow me, Elizabeth whispered, and don't make any noise. Wondering why I always let Elizabeth lead me into danger, I crept through the woods behind her. Every time I stepped on a twig, she turned and said, Shush! Before long, I felt like Small at the end of Pooh's long line of explorers in search of the North Pole. I was being shushed all the time, but there was no one for me to shush. It wasn't fair. Suddenly, I heard voices, and Elizabeth dropped to the ground. Following her example, I flopped down on my stomach and lay there, limp with fear. Not far away, barely visible through the underbrush, was a small hut. It had 2 windows with real glass in them and a crooked chimney poking out its roof. A few feet from the door, Gordy, Doug, and Toad were sitting on a log in a clearing, smoking cigarettes. The trees cast a molten shade over them as a breeze stirred the leaves. Can you hear what they're saying? Elizabeth whispered to me. When I shook my head, she said, If we sneak up to that tree, we can listen to every word. Commando style, she crept toward a tall oak with a reassuringly thick trunk, and I crawled after her. The closer we got, the louder my heart thumped. Okay, stop, Elizabeth whispered. I lay flat and tried to breathe normally. The dusty smell of tree bark tickled my nose, and I shifted away from it, afraid I might sneeze. Gordy was wearing his army helmet and a pair of baggy shorts. The cigarette dangling from his lower lip made him seem older and even meaner than usual. Just looking at him made me feel weak. There's no Nazi plane that can come close to a B-24, Doug was saying. My cousin Harry flies one, and he ought to know. How about a Panzer, though? Gordy asked. Our tanks aren't as good as them. What are you, some kind of Hitler lover? Toad asked. Everything we have is better than German junk. That's why we'll win. We're the best. For at least 10 minutes, Elizabeth and I eavesdropped on the most boring conversation I'd ever heard in my life. All the boys did was argue about which planes, tanks, submarines, guns, bombs, and hand grenades were the best. I nudged Elizabeth a couple of times, trying to signal her to leave, but she seemed to be hanging on every word the boys said. Warily, I waited for something to happen. Anything would be better than lying in the weeds with ants crawling up and down my bare legs. Finally, Doug said, Okay, which pinup do you like best? Betty Grable, Toad said. That picture of her looking over her shoulder, in the bathing suit and high heels? Nah, Gordy said. Rita Hayworth gets my vote. She's really sexy. How about Jane Russell? Doug said. She's got the biggest chest. He stood up and cupped his hands to demonstrate. Hubba, hubba, he said, and wiggled his hips. I don't know how long they would have laughed if I hadn't finally sneezed. That dusty smell had tickled and tugged at my nose, making it itch till I couldn't stand it. Gordy jumped to his feet and yelled, and Elizabeth and I ran off through the woods, ducking and dodging trees and low limbs. A branch whipped my face hard enough to bring tears to my eyes. Brambles slashed my legs. I stumbled over something and almost fell, but I kept on going, and so did Elizabeth. Behind us, I heard the boys crashing through the bushes, shouting and calling us names. They'd kill us if they caught us. I was sure of it. Just as we reached the fence, Doug grabbed my jersey and yanked me backward. Let me go, I cried, wiggling and twisting, trying to break free. Let me go! What the hell are you girls doing down here? Gordy yelled at Elizabeth. He caught her wrists. The jugular vein in his neck pulsed, and the jagged scar over his eyebrow was purple against his pale skin. You took our boards, Elizabeth shouted. Her face was red with anger, and her hair blazed like white fire in the hot sunlight. We want them back. Gordy held her wrists tighter and sneered at her. You just can't stay away from me, can you, lizard? Don't call me that, Elizabeth yelled. Drawing back one leg, she kicked Gordy in the shins hard enough to make him wince. I wouldn't try that again, lizard, Gordy said. He paused a moment and glanced at me. Then, pitching his voice lower, he said, You little dopes don't know it, but I just saved your miserable lives. Not that I expect either one of you to thank me for it. What are you talking about? Elizabeth asked. Are you nuts or something? Haven't you heard about the crazy man who lives in these woods? Hasn't anybody warned you? Gordy looked at Elizabeth scornfully. Liar, Elizabeth said. There's no crazy man around here. He was standing right behind you with a knife in his hand, Gordy said. But you were so busy spying on us, you didn't even notice. Where is he now? Elizabeth was doing her best to sound as sassy as she had before, but I could hear a little uncertainty creeping into her voice. As for me, I was so scared my saliva dried up. My mouth felt like sand. I didn't think I could say a word, let alone scream for help. He ran when he saw us coming, Gordy went on, just because he was outnumbered. I don't believe you, Elizabeth said. She looked at Doug and Toad, but they were nodding their heads, backing up Gordy. You girls better stay out of the woods, Gordy said. I may not be here to save you next time. I've never heard anyone say there was a crazy man down here, Elizabeth persisted. The boys had let go of us by now, but we stayed where we were, waiting to hear what Gordy would say next. That's because it's top secret, Lizard, Gordy said. You know the experimental farm over there? He pointed across the field at a cluster of brick buildings owned by the state university, and Elizabeth nodded. She kept her eyes slightly narrowed on Gordy's face, but I had the feeling she was beginning to believe in the crazy man. Well, those scientists don't just do stuff for the university, he went on. They get army contracts sometimes. They were working with chemicals to see if they could make men braver and stronger, better soldiers or something. But the guy they were experimenting on went crazy. They couldn't control him. They kept him locked up for a while in one of the stables, but a couple of weeks ago he broke out. He's loose in the woods, and he'll kill anyone he gets his hands on. He's got a knife this long. Gordy held his hands about 2 feet apart. That's what he was coming after you with, he shouted, and I was so startled I jumped at least 6 inches straight up in the air. So you better stay away from here, see? Gordy shoved his face so close to Elizabeth's she stumbled backward. Why don't they catch him? She asked. Don't you think they've tried? Gordy looked over his shoulder at the silent woods. It's a jungle back there, he whispered, and the crazy man is real smart. He can just disappear into the underbrush. You don't know where he is until... Gordy gave a blood-curdling scream and grabbed Elizabeth around the neck. He's got you! As scary as Gordy's scream was, something else terrified me even more. Without waiting for Elizabeth or anyone else, I leapt the fence and took off across the field as fast as I could, yelling at the top of my lungs. Hurtling down the railroad bank, I ran across the tracks without even looking for a train, scrambled up to the other side, and raced down the alley toward home. Elizabeth caught up with me before I'd gotten to the back gate. Grabbing my arm, she stopped me from running straight into the house and telling Mother everything. Don't believe Gordy, she said. He's just making it up to scare us away from his stupid hut. What are you talking about? I yelled. Didn't you see him? Elizabeth stared at me. See who? The crazy man. Just before Gordy screamed, he was hiding, watching us. His hair was all shaggy, and he was dressed in rags. I saw him. And I wasn't making it up. I'd seen the crazy man in the woods. Just a glimpse, and then he was gone. Like Gordy said, melting away into the leaves and shadows. Elizabeth shook her head impatiently. Nobody was there, she insisted. Gordy was lying. No. I was crying now. I saw him. Well, you must be nuts then, Elizabeth said. Seeing things that don't exist, that's a sign of going cuckoo. She pointed a finger at the side of her head and twirled it. I bit my lip hard to stop myself from crying. I didn't want Elizabeth to think I was crazy. Just because you didn't see him doesn't mean I didn't, I said. Elizabeth sighed. She'd lost both barrettes in the woods, and her hair spilled over her eyes like wisps of cotton. Believe what you want, she said. I know a lie when I hear one. Before I could say anything more, Mrs. Crawford opened the kitchen door and spotted us. Elizabeth, she called, time for chores. With her back to her mother, Elizabeth twisted her face into a hideous grimace. I have to go, she said. I'll see you tomorrow. As Elizabeth ran up her back steps and into her house, I took a quick look behind me. The alley was empty except for the Parker's tabby cat prowling around our garbage can. He looked at me and meowed as I latched the gate behind me and dashed inside. Mother was pushing the vacuum cleaner around the living room. Its roar made it impossible to talk, so I took the dust rag she handed me and flicked it over the radio. The bookcases flanking the mantel, the coffee table, and the matching end tables at either side of the couch. As much as I hated housework, I was glad to follow Mother from room to room, dusting chair rungs and mirror frames and whatever else needed it. This close to Mother, I was safe from the crazy man.